for joining us for election 2022. We're taking a look at the runoff primary election in Texas and, of course, the upcoming midterms as well this fall. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so at this point, we'd like to say that we're not going to have time for questions or comments, and so those features have been disabled. Now for some introductions. I'm Rebecca Rodriguez of Sunwest Communications, and joining me today is Michael Lunceford and the Honorable Jay Barksdale. A little bit about Michael, if you don't know. Michael Lunceford, for 41 years, was responsible for worldwide public affairs for Mary Kay Incorporated in nearly 40 countries around the world. He has been active in civic affairs, serving on boards in Texas and Washington, D.C., and has served as a political advisor to many elected officials locally and nationally. He formerly was a member of the Congressional Award Foundation as an appointee of U.S. Senator Bob Dole and was also a founding member of the Texas Lyceum. He is the chair of Friends of the Medical Center Political Action Committee, a board member of the Dallas Breakfast Group as well. Michael also serves on the board of the Hope for All Foundation, and he currently is the chair of the Government Relations Committee President's Advisory Board at UT Southwestern Medical School, and will soon be a principal in a new forthcoming venture from Sunwest Communications called Lunceford Web Government Relations, as we venture further into the government relations space. Also joining us today is the Honorable Jay Barksdale. Jay leads the Sunwest Government Relations practice. As senior counsel, Barksdale brings more than 2 decades of experience as a public affairs professional working with municipal, state, and federal governments. Most recently, he served as the Executive Vice President of Government Relations at a public affairs firm, the Davis Advocates, where he led legislative advocacy efforts focusing on economic development, transportation, natural resources, and other business-related policy issues. And prior to joining the Davis Advocates, Jay led the Dallas Regional Chamber's public policy efforts for more than 9 years and spent more than a decade working for the Dallas Area Rapid Transit Authority Public Affairs as part of the team that brought light rail to the Dallas area in the 1990s. And Jay also served as mayor and council member for the city of Waxahachie. And thank you both for joining us today. This is really going to be, I think, a very interesting conversation on so many levels, talking about the recent, runoff primaries in Texas. But let's start first with a little bit of context. Michael, we talked about this a little while ago, and just give it some perspective, perhaps, looking back to the 2018 midterm election. Tell us why that's so relevant right now.
Well, this is a discussion Jay and I had the other day about how the results in 2018 actually helped shape the election that we're going to have in November. People will harken back to 2018 and recall that that was the year that Beto O'Rourke ran against Ted Cruz for the United States Senate in the general election. Beto O'Rourke lost by 2.6%. But while that was incredibly close and people were really surprised by the closeness of the race, what was probably most significant out of it was that there were 12 Texas House seats that changed control. They went from the Republican column to the Democratic column. In addition to that, there were 2 state Senate seats, both in North Texas, that the Republicans lost. Connie Burton lost to Beverly Powell in Tarrant County, and Nathan Johnson, the Democrat, defeated Don Huffines, the Republican. There were also 2 congressional seats that were lost that year by Republicans. John Culberson in Houston area, and Pete Sessions in the 32nd here in Dallas. It's now occupied by Colin Allred. That incentivized the Democrats for the 2020 election. And in 2020, the Democrats, seeing that they had the opportunity perhaps to change control of the Texas House by winning 9 Texas House seats, they put $65 million into Texas that year, and over 80% of that money was from out of state. The net gain was 0. Now, what made that significant is that was on the cusp of redistricting. Right. And we saw, and I think Gromer Jeffers in a column talked about the course of the November's general election was actually determined last year in the Texas redistricting process. And that is what has shaped the situation that we're looking at in November.
I think 2018 also kind of served as a wake-up call for Republicans as well, because as you recall, in 2016, they spent a lot of effort on the transgender bathroom bill, which a lot of business in Texas was opposed to, and I think it was a message to Republicans, hey, y'all need to get back to work on key issues.
Well, I think that's right. I think there was a lot of engagement, increased engagement by the business community in the Republican primaries. I know the Associated Republicans in Texas, which is a business-minded group, has engaged heavily in Republican primaries for the last 8 years, and has done quite well. And it's a business-minded group, and it really makes a significant difference when business engages in the political process.
Talk a little bit about why the success that they gained in 2018 didn't carry over to 2020 for Democrats. I mean, because that did set the stage for redistricting, which has had a huge impact on what we're about to talk about here.
Well, I would say it's like what Jay said. I think the Republicans got back to the basics of governing, and quite successfully, in fact, and had a lot of successes to trumpet.
Yeah, they passed House Bill 3 in the Texas legislature, which was a transformative public education bill, and that was bipartisan. But Republicans got a lot of credit for it because they were in the leadership in the state. So that was a big one.
That was a big one, and I would agree that it gave focus. It provided focus. There's nothing like a dramatic change like losing 12 House seats. But you also saw the difference, for example, in the Republicans in their approach to the elections. Two of the members from the Dallas area, North Texas area, Morgan Meyer and Angie Chin Button, narrowly won in 2018. But you saw a dramatic increase in their margins for 2020, and they won re-election fairly handily by comparison to what they experienced in 2018. And both Angie Chin Button and Morgan Meyer are very critical to North Texas in the Texas legislature, wouldn't you say, Jay?
Absolutely. Both are chairmen of key committees and good legislators.
That's right, and that's really important for North Texas because one of the North Texas has not always done as well legislatively in Austin as Harris County.
Yeah. Sad but true.
Sad, yeah, it is sad but true.
So let's talk about what just happened here in Texas in terms of our statewide primary results. And I think one of the, really the races that captured so much attention was the AG's race. Ken Paxton walking away handily with a basically 2-1 victory over George P. Bush. Any surprises at that margin?
Not by me. I'm not surprised. You, Jay?
I'm not surprised that the Attorney General won, but that was a blowout.
Yeah, that was a blowout.
So, some of the headlines after that say that it's the end of the Bush dynasty. Would you go that far?
No, I think that's a little premature. George P. Bush is 46 years old, and he seems very resilient. And I don't think it's the end. I think it's just the beginning for him. He's got plenty of time to think about his political future if that's what he intends to do.
So talk a little bit about that race, though, because it has been really examined, in terms of Ken Paxton as a candidate. We've read some things about it since then. What does it say about what voters are looking for in Texas? Republican voters, anyway.
I think it depends on each of the races, frankly. Especially because for me, it's always been more of a focus for the state house, state senate races, and the key legislative races, the governor, lieutenant governor, and another office that doesn't get a lot of thought, but is very important to business in particular, is the comptroller's office.
On the George P.'s race, it seems like he tried to tack to the right, tried to appeal to Trump supporters, tried to out-Trump Mr. Paxton.
Yeah, I'd say that's right.
You know,
Good
and
point.
so that turns off moderate voters. I think aren't going to get too fired up to support him if he's trying to out Trump Paxton. I'm no political expert.
Well, let's talk a little bit though about, you mentioned other races. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is going to face Democrat Mike Cuellar. And Jay, you were looking at that race in particular, thinking that he would have a better chance, there than his opponent, Michelle Beckley, would have had.
I think so. This is a rematch. So Collier has done this before, so he knows how to run statewide. And nothing against Miss Beckley, but she doesn't have that experience other than in this primary. So I just think Collier's going to put up a better candidacy than she would.
We haven't seen that kind of a dynamic, though. I mean, it's been, 25 years since you've had a Republican governor and a Democrat lieutenant governor. I mean, thinking back to Bush and Bullock. I don't know that we've seen it since then.
I don't recall, because I remember the Bullock-Bush dynamic, but I knew Bob pretty well. And Bob was, and I'll just say this, in my own dealings with Bob Bullock, you could make a deal with Bob Bullock. I mean, you could go and have a fruitful conversation. I don't know Mr. Collier. I don't know what kind of style he has.
What do you think about that kind of a dynamic? I mean, is it something that is in our past? Is it something that we can hope for in the future? I mean, because I think that is what appeals to people who consider themselves centrist on either party.
Well, I don't. I think everything is in its season, and I don't know whether or not, back there was a lot of collegiality. I think back in those days. I don't know. Again, I go back to Mr. I don't know Mr. Collier. I don't know whether or not he would have a collegial approach or not. I don't really. I'm not familiar with his politics.
And back to your question, there's not going to be any more Bob Bullocks elected in Texas.
No,
now with social media and everybody having a camera, he was quite a character, and amazing.
He was. He was able. He had some really great quips. I would say. But I think the other thing about it, my understanding is, Lieutenant Governor Patrick has $25 million. I think Mr. Collier may be hard pressed to match that kind of fundraising prowess. And Mr. Patrick is not. He is a very energetic lieutenant governor.
Yeah.
So I do not see anybody creeping up on him and surprising him. Because if you go back to when he originally ran against an incumbent, he was a very energetic candidate. And he's always projected that kind. I think he's always projected that kind of energy.
So lots of interesting House races, Texas House races. Anything jump out at you in terms of one or the other that was more interesting in terms of the outcome, or what it portends for November?
Stephanie Click, who's an incumbent over in Tarrant County, fought off a well-funded challenger, and I thought that was pretty impressive. She won pretty handily, 54-46, and generally, it seems to me that if you're an incumbent and you're in a primary runoff, you might be in trouble. So that was pretty impressive win to me.
She was one of in the primary. There were 39 incumbents that got challenged in the primary, 9 Democrats and 30 Republicans. And those 4 GOP incumbents in that race, in the runoffs, Click, Stevenson, Rogers, and
Cassell.
Yeah. Stevenson's the one who lost, but he didn't seem to really run a race, as best I could detect.
I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I had heard. Click, who had the backing, they had. The other 3 had very strong backing, but they were also very active in their campaigns.
One of the races we were talking about was the Texas House 70, which is a new seat, and Jay, you think that can be a competitive district, actually?
On paper, it is.
Yeah.
Michael, you said it's 49 or 50,
Yeah, the Orvis in that is 49%.
which means
It's 51% Democratic, but it's a toss-up.
yeah. But Jamie Jolly, who's wound up winning the Republican runoff, she's a good candidate, and she used to run the Plano Chamber of Commerce, and now she works for Plano ISD in their Education Foundation, and I think she'll have some crossover appeal.
She's got a strong campaign. She was the right candidate coming out of there, and that's always the key, I think, in any primary, is getting the right candidate. Jamie Jolly is the kind of candidate who was backed by a lot of business interest, who won that race, and Frederick Frazier is another one, and he came out won quite handily over his primary challenger.
And he'll be replacing Scott Sanford, assuming he wins in November. But that House 70, I can't speak this morning, but even though it's competitive this year, and I think probably Jamie will probably win that might be harder to hold on to in 2 years when you have a presidential election and a higher turnout. So it could be competitive for years to come.
Well, speaking of turnout, it's interesting. You go back and you look both at the primary election and the runoff. In the 2022, the number of Republicans that voted was almost 2 million. By comparison, the Democratic turnout was a little over 1,057,637. In the runoff, 900, and this is an approximate at this point, 928,000 Republicans voted in the runoff. 491,000 Democrats voted in the runoff. It gives you some idea about enthusiasm, because we've talked about enthusiasm, and that's always, Jay knows this from having run for city council, run for mayor, and having worked for a member of Congress. Enthusiasm matters.
Yes, that sure does. And going back to 70, you make a good point on the numbers. In Jamie Jolly's favor, there were 8,500 or so people who voted in the Republican runoff versus about 4,600 who voted in the Democratic runoff.
It's that voter enthusiasm, that you're looking at here. One of the other races is, you mentioned Vinton Jones winning the Democratic primary to replace Jasmine Crockett, who appears to be headed to Washington.
I'd say so. I think the Democratic advantage of that district's like 99-1.
There's very little to debate about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's no debate about that.
But it's interesting in that, she's really a handpicked successor, to someone who has served North Texas for a very long time, and Eddie Bernice Johnson.
I've known Eddie Bernice Johnson, and Jay's known Eddie Bernice Johnson for decades, and I think people in Dallas are really not going to understand how much they miss her until she's gone. It's like that song that says that. I didn't know how much I missed her until she was gone. Eddie Bernice Johnson, and Jay can testify to this, having worked at DART.
Yeah.
She delivered for Dallas.
Yes.
Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. That was a big win for Miss Crockett. Her opponent, Jane Hope Hamilton, sorry how quickly we forget,
Yeah.
is a good candidate and knows how to run campaigns. So that was, and the fact that Congresswoman Johnson and Pastor Freddie Haynes, I believe his name, they came out with a press conference the week before the election, kind of led me to believe that it might be tighter than it turned out. Like maybe they were getting some polling numbers that showed that it was going to be tight, but it didn't turn out that way.
No, it didn't. It didn't, and it'll be interesting to see, kind of in the context of the national election too. That right now, it's what committees does Jasmine Crockett get on, and that'll be dependent upon the size of the Democratic caucus after the November election, as to what seats are available on key committees. Because Congresswoman Johnson had always, she was senior and well liked and worked across the aisle. In fact, was a very artful legislator on behalf of Dallas.
I mean, that is where you see the difference between a senior and junior member of Congress in terms of how they serve, where they're allowed access to serve, basically.
Well, a lot of it depends on the size of the caucus too, and what kind of positioning that they can get, because those decisions about committee assignments are made at senior levels, by the House leadership. So we'll see where she lands.
So another longtime member of Congress, Henry Cuellar, still not quite certain at this point about that race. It's been tight, I think, all along. They're talking about a recount and, what may follow. Any thoughts on what's happening in that race there?
Well, Jay and I had this conversation the other day. I mean, Henry Cuellar was ahead by 177 votes, and he had declared victory, but she's yet to concede. And Jay, is your understanding that she's intending to seek a recount?
I don't know any inside info on that, but I think Mr. Cuellar is a very conservative Democrat member, and I think he may be the only pro-life member of the Democratic Party, or at least in Congress. I don't know, he's one of a few. So he's very conservative, and I think his opponent, Mrs. Cisneros, kind of represents the more progressive, way progressive end of the Democratic Party. I think she had members like AOC supporting her, and so I think if she does wind up winning that race against Mr. Cuellar, the Republican could beat her in November down there, because I don't think she aligns with a lot of the Democrats in South Texas.
Well, I don't think so either, because you've seen the gains that Republicans have made in South Texas, and I think one of the most interesting occurrences of late has been when Ryan Guion, who was in the Texas legislature as a Democrat for 20 years, changed parties. That's pretty earth-shattering, I think, and gives you some idea about the way that South Texas is trending. And Republicans at this point are looking at a wave, a significant number of gains. And you look at there was a headline in one article I read, and it said, Texas 34 special election gives GOP an early South Texas gift. And this is when one of the Democrats, Mr. Bullock, resigned in order to go to work for Aiken Gump. And there's a special election on the 14th of June. And the Republicans are actually favored to win that seat.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, even from a national level, or especially from a national level, there are folks who presume that Texas, becoming more heavily, more diverse, and more Hispanic, and certainly in South Texas, majority of the folks who live there will just automatically turn blue, and that would be enough to propel that change. What do folks miss in making that assumption?
I think that what people miss is that some of the national positions that have been taken by Democrats don't play well in South Texas. And this is the discussions I've had with people, with people from South Texas. Defund the police, the assault on fossil fuels, just and immigration and the handling of the border situation. There's a lot of really good jobs in South Texas that are created by the oil and gas industry. The law enforcement in South Texas, if you think about that, the constables, the police, the sheriff's departments, those issues resonate in a bad way, I think, with the law enforcement community in South Texas, which is predominantly Hispanic. What do you think, Jay?
Well, the Republicans aren't going to just sit back and just wait for this to happen. They're down there now recruiting candidates to make sure that any Democrats down there are at least challenged. They start down at justice of the peace to county commissioner to county judge. A lot of Democrats, elected officials down there, have run unopposed, and now they're seeing they're at least going to get a challenger.
And people underappreciate how important it is for those county positions, because county positions are partisan. And when you get to having worked for a county commissioner in Dallas, the JP and the constable and the county commissioners are all retail politicians. And those constables in particular are out there in the community every day. And it makes a significant difference when you're helping to build a bench and also stimulate voter turnout for Republicans by recruiting those people that Jay mentioned.
And going back to Ryan Guillen from Rio Grande City, that's Starr County. If you look back, the election before this primary, you might have had 100 people voting in the Republican primary for that state house seat. Now, when Ryan is a Republican in his county, a lot more voters voted in the Republican primary. So.
And here's what one of the most significant aspects of this, and again, this is one of those things where I guess if you just look, a lot of people, business people in particular, just look at the results. They never look at how that process unfolds. When Ryan Guillen switched parties and he ran in the Republican primary, he had two challengers. He won with almost 7% of the vote. That's really important victory on his part, particularly the margin of the victory, because it showed that a Democrat can switch parties and still win and win well. That gives encouragement to others who are considering whether or not they need to catch the wave. They need to catch the wave, and they need to change parties.
That's a good point. The day that Ryan switched parties, they had a press conference at the Texas Capitol, and there were tens of Republican House members who showed up from all over the state to support him in that. Republicans who were just a day ago were on the opposite side of the aisle from him. Now they're here embracing him. Governor Abbott, Speaker Phelan, they all went down there and helped him in his campaign as well. So they really wrapped their arms around him.
You know, what's really interesting is, folks, you just a minute ago mentioned, Michael, at the county level, they run it has never necessarily been seen as a partisan race.
Yeah, but it is.
Absolutely it is. But
I haven't worked for a county commissioner.
No, it absolutely is. But my point is, I think for voters, there has not been that distinction. And I think what we've seen in the past few years, and I'd love your insight on this, obviously, but, the echoes of what we hear on the national level, we are now hearing the most local level races, even into school board races and city council races. And there are words and ideas that have filtered down to help identify these candidates, I think, provide an identity to these candidates who heretofore maybe it was irrelevant whether they were an R or a D.
Well, candidate recruitment is always important. I mean, you cannot just put find anybody who's going to run as a Democrat or Republican without them being a quality candidate. The quality of the candidate really matters a lot, and is how I grew up in politics was. And Jay and I've known one another a long time now, and we both worked for really very popular elected officials. But we also saw, I saw the difference between good candidates and bad candidates. And I think that's candidate recruitment is extremely important. And I think that's why, as I mentioned earlier, that in the Republican primary, that there's that group of Associated Republicans of Texas has worked diligently to try to recruit the right kind of candidate.
That is a troubling trend, though, Rebecca. It's like when I served on the city council, we had people who you knew. This guy sitting next to you is a Republican. He might even be a precinct chair. This is a Democrat over here. But we all worked together on the issues, and it had less to do with partisanship. It's really true. I mean, the Democrat might vote more conservative than Republican on some issues. You just can't define them by the word. But what I'm seeing happen at city councils and school boards around here is really troubling to me. And at some point it gets hard to get well-minded people to run. who really want to serve. Why would you put yourself through that?
Well, I agree. I agree with that. I think the lack of congeniality sidelines a lot of thoughtful people who aren't wanting to drag themselves into the vortex of that unpleasantness.
I'm glad my service was before social media. I'll say
Yeah.
that.
I'm glad
All
I
had to
never
worry
ran
about
for
lettuce
office.
There you go.
I wasn't as brave as Jay.
It does take some courage, absolutely, certainly these days. We talked a little bit about, the lower voter turnout among, perhaps the parties, but overall, less than 20% of registered voters, turned out.
I'd say that's right. In the Republican primary, it was 11 points. This is in the primary. 11.63% turned out. Democrats, by contrast, 6.69%. Now, Republicans was actually up 1.5% from 2018.
Yeah.
Democrats were up by 0.39%.
And Jay, you made a good point. You said these are the high intensity voters. Tell me first of all what you think that means. How do you identify, how would you, define a high intensity voter?
That's somebody who's going to go out in a rainstorm or a tornado and vote for their people. If you're not as intense, you'll vote if it's convenient for you, if you remember, But if you don't vote, you're letting the high intensity people decide for you who your candidate's going to be. Especially nowadays that the districts are getting so less competitive. The race is really in the primary, both in the Republican and the Democrat. So if you sit that out, the high intensity voters are choosing who your next representative is going to be in November.
Do you see that changing?
Well, I think it'll only change with significant effort on the part of either the candidates themselves as they go through an identification process and identify their voter, and then how many touches do they have to have with a voter, with a potential voter, to get them out. And the amount of data available on voters now is so dramatically different than what it was, say when George W. Bush became president of the United States. And that at the time was the way they went through voter identification and turnout was really, earth-shattering at the time. But now the number of data points on people, on the voter, is many-fold greater than what they had then. So the question is, how do you get them? How many times do you have to touch them, and what do you have to say to them to get them to come out? And a lot of that has to do with the voter profile.
The business community is really concerned about this lack of voting by our population, and they've made some efforts to get their members of the chambers, to get their employees to go out and vote, particularly on their issues that are important to their industry. But it's very difficult to get people motivated to vote. And I think part of it is that there's so many election dates. You mentioned that we'll get the special election in Congress next month down there.
Right.
I'd forgot about that.
Yeah,
you got your city races, and you got your state races, and then the runoffs for each. It's just like it's almost like keeping up with Netflix shows or something. It's really challenging.
There are a lot of elections. The community college district, for example,
Yeah.
has got a very unusual date. When it sets its elections, and I've always
And election day is not a holiday either.
right.
I don't know if it should be, but it's certainly not.
No, it just goes back to folks making the effort to go vote, and some would argue making voting more accessible to people, make it more convenient, perhaps. Are there ways to do that? And then we get into a much deeper issue, obviously.
Well, on the matter of convenience, it's really pretty convenient for people to go vote, and I think that it's a matter of desire on the part of the individual. I think there was confusion to some degree, I'd say, in mail-in ballots versus absentee ballots. I think most people don't understand the difference between mail-in ballots. and mail-in ballots are, something we saw in this election past where everybody got a ballot, but you have to go through a voter identification to make sure that the ballot's going to actually voters. And absentee ballots are something that you request, and those have always been there and available.
Talking about elections and all, I think, Jay, you mentioned that one of the first actions that the Texas Senate will take next session is to draw for 2 or 4 year terms after redistricting. Why is that significant?
Well, it's important to the senators whether or not they
Well,
have
imagine,
to
yeah,
turn
very
around
much
and-
so.
I call that personal.
whether or not they have to run in 2 years
Right.
versus getting a break and
Right.
and run it in 4 years. That also kind of can have a dynamic where House members looking to move up and challenge them might do that if the senator's up in 2 years and can run against a House member or somebody else could run against them before they really get established as a senator, before they get a record,
Right.
particularly for a new senator.
What do you think? Would you care to guess how that may go?
No.
I don't know. Yeah, you talk about that's really is a luck of the draw.
So anyway, I guess we would be remiss actually to talk about the impact of the economy, which is on the minds of a lot of people, and one of those long-term issues that probably won't change dramatically, or I guess it's anyone's guess to some degree, between now and the midterms in November. How significant is that going to be? First of all, in Texas, state races. Does that have as much of an impact as people perceive it to have, in terms of their votes for national elections?
Well, inflation is on everybody's mind because they go and they buy gas and they go to the grocery store. And even though a report I saw in the Wall Street Journal, real wages had increased by, I think it was 5.5%, but inflation was running at 8.3%. And yesterday, I think the inflation rate was just a little lower than what its high in 40 years ago. So inflation is a day-to-day reminder for everybody. We were in Maine recently, and we were paying $4.86 a gallon for regular gas. And that doesn't seem to be abating. And groceries, they're expensive. And with diesel fuel going up, you have to assume that there's a potentiality for more increases because so many goods generally move by truck.
And in general, the party that's in power in Washington usually has a hard time in the midterms anyway. And then you throw in this inflation that you're talking about. The Democrats have pretty strong headwinds for trying to hold on to the House, U.S. House.
Well, and remember too, one of the interesting aspects of that is the number of House seats that Republicans picked up when Biden won the presidency. They picked up 13 seats, which was an anomaly for a presidential race, presidential election year. And now you've got just how many seats? Democrats have a relatively small margin in the House, and they've got it's tied in the Senate.
Unlike 2018, which we began talking about, or even 2020, North Texas really seems to be lacking congressional swing districts. What's happened to the swing district across the state, basically?
There's not many. There's not many, but I guess looking on the bright side of that is that you've got two strong advocates for North Texas in the Congressional delegation, and that's Mark Vesey and Colin Allred, who are really great people to work with and are very approachable for the business community. On the legislative side, I think you've got some really very solid people to work with, both Democrat and Democrat being in the Senate, somebody that I worked with on a legislation last session was Nathan Johnson. He's a very thoughtful member of the state Senate, and Morgan Meyer and Angie Chin Button are, with whom I've worked, are really excellent to work with. So I think in that regard, that's a positive.
Yeah. But it could be concerning if as you spend time in the legislature or in Congress, and you don't really have to worry about getting beat by someone from the other party. You're worried about getting outflanked by someone within your party.
Right.
Can lead to some extreme issues arising. Instead of we're talking about focused on what's important, we could have some whatever the next critical race theory is, or transgender bathroom bill. I mean, I don't even know what they're dreaming up to worry about in the future.
But that's why it's important for the business community to engage with members, and to go to members and talk to members. And continual engagement's really important, because I'd say that it's been my personal experience in dealing with members, no matter whether or not it was in Texas or in other states, is a continual engagement with members helps build a relationship and provides you the opportunity to go and talk to them about issues that are critical to you. You can't suddenly have a crisis and go and ask a member to do something for you if they don't have a relationship with you.
Which races are we looking at more closely as we head into November?
Well, I'd say at the congressional level in the state of Texas, what happens with the outcome in the runoff between Henry Cuellar and Jessica Cisneros will be a very, very important as to which way that seat goes. If Jessica Cisneros wins, then as Jay said earlier, the Republicans have a good opportunity to pick that up. Less so with Henry Cuellar. And then in House District 70, I think Jamie Jolly is a very solid candidate and could win that race. And I don't know, what other districts are you thinking about, Jay?
It seems like most of the other ones are pretty firmed up. I think we might be able to predict pretty well who's going to win.
What would it take, to really change the core beliefs that voters have today, at this point in time, and make anything other than the likely outcome come to pass?
People who don't normally vote get interested and vote. I mean, it'd have to be a dramatic increase in the number of people who voted might change some things.
I'd say that's right. It's all up to the electorate to make a decision whether or not they want to go vote or not. But right now, all the energy is on the Republican side.
All right, so that's our time for now. Thank you all both for joining us. We really do appreciate your time, your insight, really, more than anything. And thank you for watching as well. We really appreciate that. If you'd like to watch again, you can also catch this webcast on sunwestpr.com or on our LinkedIn page.